Jake Holloway didn't stop the wagon because he was a good man. He stopped it because Ben Carter, 7 years old, barefoot, his feet cracked open and bleeding from miles of scorched Texas road, fell face first into the dirt and didn't move. Jake heard the sound before he saw the boy. Not crying. Something worse than crying. The silence that comes after a child has cried so long he has nothing left. Jake pulled the reins hard, jumped down before the wheels stopped rolling, and pushed through the circle of Dry Creek townspeople who stood around 4 collapsed children and did absolutely nothing. If this story moves you, if you believe one person can still change everything, subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that road. Let's go back to the moment everything changed. The summer of 1878 came down on Dry Creek, Texas like something personal. The well water had gone low by June. The cattle were restless. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed had dropped half their leaves by July, the way they only did when the land was truly suffering, when the heat wasn't just a season, but a punishment. By the time August arrived, the road into town shimmered like standing water from 50 yards out, and the air tasted like iron and ash. Jake Holloway had been making the supply run he made every 2 weeks. Flour salt cartridges, a small tin of coffee he allowed himself as the one luxury in an otherwise stripped-down life. His ranch sat 4 miles outside of town on the western edge of the flats, far enough that most people forgot he existed, which suited him fine. He'd been forgetting himself for 3 years. He was good at it. He saw the dust cloud before he saw the children. Then he saw them. 4 of them. Moving in a loose cluster along the side of the road, the oldest girl, 13 maybe, with her arm around the youngest boy, half dragging him, her dress so caked with road dust it had gone gray from hem to waist. The second boy walked with his head down and both fists clenched like a person bracing against wind that wasn't there. The smaller girl walked apart from the others, her eyes fixed on something none of them could see, her lips moving without sound. Jake's eyes went to the youngest boy's feet. He registered what he was seeing. The cracked, bleeding soles, the way the boy was walking on the outsides of his ankles to keep the worst of the wounds off the ground. And something in his chest made a sound like a door being forced open after years of being sealed shut. He brought the wagon to the edge of the road and watched. What he was watching was the town. A woman in a blue dress stepped onto her porch, looked at the children for a long moment, then went back inside and pulled the door closed behind her. A man in a leather apron, Jake recognized him. Hendricks from the feed store stepped out of his shop, crossed his arms, and stood watching the children pass. He didn't move. He didn't speak. 2 men outside the saloon turned to look when Emma Carter called out, "Please, water. My brother needs water." One of them said something to the other low, and they both went back inside. A curtain moved in the window above the general store. Then it went still. The oldest girl, Emma, kept walking. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were red from crying that had happened a long time ago, not recently. She was past recently. She was somewhere harder and further along than recently. She was holding her family together with her 2 hands and her locked jaw, and whatever was left in her after miles of that road and every door in Dry Creek was staying shut. Ben went down first. He didn't cry out. He just crumpled the way very small, exhausted children do, with a kind of boneless finality, and his face hit the dirt, and he lay still. Emma dropped to her knees beside him and grabbed his face in both hands. "Ben, Ben, look at me." Her voice cracked down the middle. "Benjamin Carter, you open your eyes right now. Do you hear me?" Noah was already on the other side of him, pressing 2 fingers to his little brother's neck, the way someone had once taught him to do, his face gone white under the dust. "He's breathing," Noah said. "He's breathing, Emma. I know he's breathing. I can see he's breathing." Emma's voice broke entirely, and she pressed her forehead against her brother's, and she shook one hard shake like something in her had been struck. And then she pulled herself back and looked up at the circle of people who had gathered on the sidewalks and storefronts to watch. "Please," she said. Her voice wasn't begging. It was something past begging. It was the voice of a girl who had already learned that begging didn't work, and was using the word anyway because there was nothing else left. "He's 7 years old. He needs water. Somebody please give him water." Nobody moved. Jake had already jumped down from the wagon. He didn't decide to do it. There was no moment of deliberation, no weighing of consequences. He was on the wagon seat, and then he was on the ground, and then he was moving through the watching people with a canteen in his hand, and the crowd parted for him, the way crowds part for someone who is moving with absolute certainty, and he went down on one knee in the dirt beside Ben Carter and got the canteen to the boy's lips. "Easy," Jake said. "Easy now. Small sips." Ben's eyes opened, dark eyes glazed with heat and exhaustion, finding Jake's face with the desperate focus of someone grabbing at the only solid thing in reach. He drank. He coughed. He drank again. Jake looked up at Emma. Up close he could see the toll the road had taken, the blisters on her hands, the sunburn across her nose and cheeks that had gone past red into something rawer, the way she was holding herself upright through sheer grinding will. "How long have you been walking?" he asked. "Since before first light," she said. He looked at the sun. It was past 2 in the afternoon. He looked at the crowd on the sidewalk. Every face he knew. Hendricks, the Pullen sisters, Mayor Rourke standing in the doorway of the barber shop with his thumbs in his vest pockets and his face carefully blank. Deputy Callum Briggs, arms folded, watching from the shade of the livery. "Somebody want to explain to me," Jake said, and his voice came out quiet, which was always worse than loud, "why these children have been walking past your doors in 100-degree heat, and not one of you opened up." Silence. Then Hendricks said, "That ain't your business, Holloway." "I'm making it my business." "You don't know who they are." "I don't need to know who they are. They're children." Briggs pushed off the livery wall and walked toward him with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who had learned that authority lives in pace. "Holloway, these are the Carter kids. You understand what I'm saying? The Carter kids. Their daddy had dealings with Black Ridge, and those dealings went sideways, and that is a matter for the law to sort out, not you. You load those children in your wagon. You're putting yourself in the middle of something that ain't got nothing to do with you." Jake looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Ben, who had gotten one hand wrapped around his canteen and was drinking with his eyes closed, both hands shaking. He looked at Lily, who was standing 3 feet away from everyone, her arms wrapped around herself, her lips still moving without sound. He looked at Noah, who was watching Jake with an expression that held no hope in it, the expression of a boy who had already stopped expecting anything from adults. "Help me get him in the wagon," Jake said to Noah. Noah blinked. Then he moved. They got Ben up between them, Jake taking most of the weight, and Jake lifted him into the wagon bed and settled him in the shade of the supply sacks. Emma was already climbing up after him, not asking, not waiting for permission. Lily went to the wagon wheel and put one hand on it, and looked up at Jake, and he took her arm and helped her up, and she sat down beside Ben and put one hand on his chest without speaking. Jake turned back to the crowd. "You all have a fine afternoon," he said. He climbed up to the seat. Noah stood in the road looking at the wagon, and then looking at Briggs, who was still standing there with his arms folded, and then looking at Jake. "You coming?" Jake said. Noah grabbed the side of the wagon and pulled himself up. Jake got the horses moving. Behind them, he heard Briggs call out, "You're making a mistake, Holloway." He didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, and his hands steady on the reins, and he drove the 4 Carter children out of Dry Creek and toward his ranch, and he did not look back. They made it to the ranch by late afternoon. Jake got Ben inside first, got him lying down on the cot near the window with a wet cloth on his forehead and more water in reach, and the boy was asleep before Jake had finished filling the cup. Emma sat on the floor beside the cot and watched her brother breathe. Her hands were folded in her lap. She didn't speak. Jake built up the stove and put on a pot of beans and cornbread. He found the last of a cured ham he'd been saving and cut it up and put it in with the beans. He pulled his extra blankets out of the chest at the foot of his bed. He didn't make conversation. He let the children settle in their own time, in their own way. Noah took himself outside. Jake gave him 10 minutes, then went to the doorway and leaned against the frame. The boy was sitting on the porch steps, knees up, staring at the flats. He hadn't cried. He looked like someone who had decided at some point recently that crying was a thing he was no longer going to do, and had meant it. "You eat anything today?" Jake asked. "No, sir." "Food'll be ready in a bit." "Yes, sir." Quiet for a moment. The evening was coming in cool, off the desert, the way Texas evenings sometimes surprised you in August, the day brutal, and the dusk almost kind. "Who do you belong to?" Jake asked. "You got family somewhere that we can send word?" Noah turned and looked at him, and something in the boy's eyes landed on Jake like a hand on his shoulder. "We don't got anybody," Noah said. "Our mama and daddy are dead." Jake held his gaze. "The deputy said they had dealings with Black Ridge. Daddy worked for them." Noah's jaw tightened. "He was a surveyor. He mapped the land for them, all the water rights, all the ranch boundaries out west of here. He did the work they needed him to do, and then—" He stopped, swallowed. "Then he found something he wasn't supposed to find, and he tried to do something about it, and they killed him for it. Him and Mama both. And the sheriff wrote it up as a wagon accident, and everybody in town decided to believe it because believing it was easier than not believing it." Jake said nothing. Noah reached into the front of his shirt and pulled out a tin box, the kind that held sewing needles or tobacco, and held it in both hands, looking down at it. "He gave it to me," Noah said. "Before they came for him, he gave me this, and he said, 'Noah, you keep this safe, and you don't let anybody take it, and someday the right person will know what to do with it.' And then 2 days later they came and took him and Mama, and I haven't—" His voice fractured. He pressed his mouth shut for a moment. "I haven't known who the right person is. I don't know if that person exists." "What's in it?" Jake asked. Noah opened the box. Inside, folded very small, were documents, papers covered in tight handwriting, surveying notations, columns of numbers, what looked like deed records and correspondence. On top of everything else was a single hand-drawn map with notations in red ink covering most of the Western Territory outside Dry Creek, with Black Ridge's mark on parcels that Jake recognized as belonging to families who had lived on that land for a generation. He found out they were falsifying the land surveys, Noah said, pushing families off their water rights through forged documents. The Bakers lost their ranch, the Harmon family, the Delacroix place. All of it funneled back to Black Ridge through claim filings nobody knew about, and they were poisoning the well water upriver to push folks off the land that wouldn't sell. He refolded the papers carefully and closed the tin. "There's enough in here to bring the whole company down. Daddy was going to take it to the federal land commissioner in Austin. He never got the chance." Jake looked at the tin box in the boy's hands. He thought about Briggs, standing in the road with his arms folded. He thought about every curtain that had moved and gone still. He thought about Emma's face, not the desperation in it, but the hardness underneath the desperation, the way a 13-year-old girl had learned to build walls out of necessity. "Noah," he said. "How old are you?" 12. "You've been carrying that box since your parents died." "Yes, sir. And you've been taking care of your sisters and your brother since then." "Yes, sir." The boy's voice had gone very careful and flat, the way voices go when the only alternative is falling apart. "There wasn't anybody else." Jake sat down on the steps beside him. It was a thing he did without thinking about it, getting down to a child's level, and he hadn't done it in 3 years, and the familiarity of the gesture hit him somewhere low and old and tender. "You did right," Jake said. "Getting them here, walking that road. That took something." Noah didn't answer for a moment. Then quietly, "Ben almost didn't make it. He made it. Because of you. Because you kept him moving long enough for me to find you." Noah looked at him sideways, the assessment of a child who had learned to read adults quickly and for survival. "Why'd you stop?" he asked. "Everybody else knew who we were. Everybody else knew what touching us meant. Why didn't you just drive past?" Jake thought about it. He thought about the answer that would sound good, the answer that was clean and noble, and the kind of thing a man said when he wanted to be thought well of. Then he thought about Ben's face in the dirt and the silence that had been worse than crying. "Because I couldn't," he said. It was the most honest answer he had. "I just couldn't." Noah looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, and something shifted in him. Not trust, not yet. It was too early for trust, but something adjacent to it. The first loosening of a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. "Mr. Holloway," he said. "Jake. Jake." He said it carefully, like a word in a foreign language he was choosing to learn. "They're going to come looking for us. When they find out we're here. I know." "You don't know what they're capable of." Jake thought about the papers in the tin box. He thought about families pushed off their land, about well water deliberately poisoned, about a man and a woman in a wagon that wasn't an accident. "I've got a fair idea," he said. "They have money. They have the sheriff. They probably have half the men in Dry Creek on some kind of payroll by now." Noah's hands tightened around the tin. "What we got is 4 kids and a rancher who lives alone at the edge of the flats." Jake was quiet for a moment. "We've also got what's in that box," he said. Noah looked at him. "Your daddy was right," Jake said. "That's what matters. The right thing in the right hands. We just have to figure out whose hands those are." He stood up. "Come eat something, all of you. We'll talk through the rest when you've had food and sleep." Noah stood too. At the door he stopped. He still had the tin box in one hand. He looked at Jake, this man he'd known for 3 hours. This stranger who had stopped his wagon in the road and gotten down in the dirt with them, and then, with the absolute gravity of a 12-year-old boy who understood exactly the weight of what he was transferring, he held out the tin. "My daddy said when the right person came, I'd know," Noah said. "I think you're the right person, Jake." Jake looked at the tin for a moment. He took it. Inside the ranch, Emma's voice came through the doorway, low, careful talking Lily through something the steady, patient voice of a girl who had mothered her little sister through weeks of nightmares and silence and grief. Ben was asleep on the cot. The beans were coming to a boil. Jake Holloway stood on the porch of his ranch at the edge of the Texas flats, with a tin box full of evidence that could get them all killed, and 4 children who had nobody left in the world, and he understood that he had just stepped off the edge of the life he'd been hiding inside for 3 years. He went back inside and stirred the beans. In the morning, the real reckoning would begin. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the ranch wasn't empty. Jake didn't sleep. He sat at the table with the tin box open in front of him and a candle burned down to a nub, and he went through every paper Thomas Carter had folded into that small space with the patience and precision of a man who understood that whatever he was holding was either going to save 4 children's lives or get them all killed, and he needed to know which one before morning came. The documents were meticulous. Thomas Carter had been a thorough man. Every forged deed was laid alongside the original survey record, the discrepancies marked in red ink with a steady hand. Every bribe was documented amounts, dates, the initials of the men who had received payment. There were letters too written in a cramped formal style from someone inside Black Ridge's land office to the company's regional director discussing the water contamination strategy along the Upper Creek as a way to accelerate the departure of the Harmon family and the 2 Delacroix brothers from their holdings. The letters referred to it in the language of business. Efficient. Clean. Like poisoning a family's water supply was a line item in a quarterly report. Jake turned a page and stopped. His own name was on it. Not in a letter. In a column. A list of properties targeted for acquisition in the second phase of Black Ridge's expansion, each one with a projected purchase price beside it and beside the ones where the owner had declined to sell, a single notation in the margin. Alternate measures. Holloway Ranch. 40 acres West Flats. Alternate measures. Jake sat with that for a long moment. He turned the page over, turned it back. He hadn't been a bystander who'd wandered into something. He had already been on their list. The Carter children hadn't brought Black Ridge's attention to his door. They'd just made sure he couldn't pretend he hadn't noticed the knock. He closed the box when the first gray light came through the window. Emma was awake before he heard her move. She appeared in the doorway of the back room without a sound, her hair loose. Her dress still the same dust-gray wreck from the day before, her eyes going immediately to the tin box on the table and then to Jake's face. "You read all of it," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did." She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table. She was 13 years old, and she sat like a judge. "Then you know," she said. "I know enough. Tell me the rest. Tell me what you saw the night they took your parents." Emma's jaw tightened. "The others are still asleep." "Good. Then you can tell me without worrying about upsetting them." She looked at him for a long time, measuring something. Then she said, "It was past midnight. I woke up because I heard voices outside, men's voices, low the way men talk when they don't want to be heard, but they're not afraid of being heard either, if that makes sense. Like they were used to doing this." She paused. "I went to the window. There were 3 men on horses and 1 wagon. Daddy came out onto the porch with his hands up, not because anyone told him to, just because he knew. He already knew what it was. He looked back at the door and I saw his face and—" Her voice stopped. She picked it back up. "He was scared for us, not for himself. He was looking at the door because we were behind it and he was scared for us." Jake held very still. "They put him in the wagon," Emma continued. "Mama came out behind him and one of the men grabbed her arm and she fought him. She actually fought him. She scratched at his face and he cursed at her." A brief, fierce flicker crossed Emma's expression, something that looked almost like pride. "Daddy called out to her, told her to stop, told her it was going to be all right." And she stopped. She stopped fighting, and she looked back at the house one more time, and then she let them put her in the wagon. Emma's hands on the table had gone white at the knuckles. The man who grabbed her arm, he had a brand on the back of his hand. A B and an R burned together. Black Ridge. He was on their payroll. "Did you recognize any of the others?" Emma's eyes went flat and careful. "One of them." Jake waited. "Deputy Briggs," she said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Jake let it settle. "You're certain?" he said. "He took his hat off when he was talking to my father. I saw his face clear as anything. Callum Briggs." Emma's voice had gone very quiet. "So when you understand why nobody in town helped us yesterday, you understand it isn't just fear. Some of them are paid. Some of them are complicit. And the man wearing the badge is the worst one of all." Jake got up and poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of Emma without asking whether she wanted it. She wrapped both hands around it like someone much older than 13. "Your father's plan was Austin," Jake said. "The federal land commissioner." "That was before." Emma looked at the tin box. "Now, I don't know if Austin is far enough." He was about to answer when he heard the sound of a horse moving up the road toward the ranch. Not fast, deliberate, the kind of approach that wanted to be heard. Jake was at the door before Emma finished standing up. The rider was a man Jake half knew, Denton Marsh, who ran cattle for Black Ridge on the eastern range, a broad, quiet man who had always kept to himself at the feed store and the church, and never caused trouble that Jake knew of. He rode up to the fence and stopped and took off his hat. "Morning, Holloway," Marsh said. "Marsh. Heard you picked up some strays yesterday." "I picked up 4 children who were dying of heat in the road," Jake said, "because every door in town was shut." Marsh turned his hat in his hands. He had the look of a man delivering a message he hadn't written and wasn't proud of. "Word is those children are carrying property that doesn't belong to them. Word is Black Ridge is interested in having that property returned before things get complicated." "What kind of complicated?" Marsh looked at him. "The kind you don't walk back from, Jake. I'm not here to threaten you. I want you to understand that. I'm here because some of the men at Black Ridge know you, and they'd rather do this quiet. They're extending a courtesy." "That's generous of them." "It is, and I'd take it seriously if I were you." Marsh's voice dropped a notch. "You live out here alone, long way from anybody. A man can have an accident a long way from anybody, and nobody finds out about it till it's been a good long while." "Like a wagon accident?" Jake said. Marsh's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes and then went still again. "I'm just passing along a message." "You passed it. Now you can go." Marsh held his look for another moment. Then he settled his hat back on his head and turned his horse and rode back down the road the way he'd come. Slow, unhurried, a man with nothing to prove. Jake stood at the fence and watched him go and did the math in his head. How long before Briggs decided the courtesy call hadn't worked? How long before courtesy ran out? He turned around and Noah was standing behind him. The boy had heard every word. "How long do we have?" Noah said. "Not long enough to do nothing," Jake said. "Long enough to do something if we start now." He put his hand briefly on Noah's shoulder, one firm grip, and then let go. "Get your sisters up. We need to talk, all of us." They gathered at the table, all 5 of them, Jake and 4 children who belonged to a dead man's courage and a murdered woman's last look at a door. Ben was still pale from the day before, but he was upright, both hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee, sweetened with the last of Jake's sugar. Lily sat beside him with her hands in her lap, looking at the surface of the table, her lips moving in that silent way they had, whatever she was saying, going only to herself. Jake put the tin box in the center of the table. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "All of you, even you, Ben. You're old enough to hear straight." Ben looked at him with those dark, serious eyes. "Yes, sir," he said. "The papers in this box are evidence of crimes that go from this county all the way up to the territorial capital. Your father documented everything: the forged surveys, the bribery, the deliberate poisoning of the Upper Creek water. He built a case that could bring Black Ridge down completely." Jake paused. "He also built a case that cost him his life. So the question in front of us is what we do with what he built." "We take it to Austin," Emma said immediately. That was his plan. "Austin is 4 days' ride. We'd have to get through every road Briggs controls to do it. Then we find another way." "There's a federal land office in El Paso," Noah said. "I heard Daddy mention it once. He said if anything happened, El Paso was the backup. He knew a man there, a land commissioner named Halford. Said Halford was the one honest man in the whole territorial structure." Jake thought about El Paso. He knew the route. He'd made it twice in his life, once in better circumstances, once in worse. 3 days hard riding across open country, most of it without water. With 4 children, one of them Ben's age, one of them not speaking. "It's possible," he said carefully. "It's necessary," Emma said. Jake looked at her. 13 years old, with her mother's last expression carved into the back of her memory, and her father's work laid out in a tin box in front of her, and the absolute unshakable certainty of a girl who had already decided what her family stood for and was not going to let it count for nothing. "All right," he said. "Jake." Noah's voice had shifted. He was looking at the box at a paper Jake hadn't noticed him pull out. "This list, the properties. Did you—" "I saw it." Noah looked up at him. "Your ranch is on it." "I know." "That means you were all ready." "I know, Noah." A silence fell over the table. Then Ben said in his small, careful voice, "Does that mean they were going to do to you what they did to Daddy?" Jake looked at the boy, 7 years old, asking the clearest question in the room. "Probably," Jake said. "Eventually." Ben thought about that. Then he said, "Then we're the same as you. We're all in the same trouble." Noah let out a sound that was almost a laugh, and not quite. Emma pressed her lips together and looked at the table. And then from Lily, who had not spoken a word in 3 weeks, who had gone so far inside herself that Jake wasn't sure she was tracking the conversation at all, came one sentence barely above a whisper, in a voice that sounded like it had forgotten its own shape. "Daddy said the truth doesn't die," Lily said. "He said it just waits." Every person at the table went absolutely still. Lily was still looking at the surface of the table. Her hands were still folded in her lap. She didn't look up. But the words hung in the air of the room with the weight of something that had been held too long in too small a space and had finally found its way out. Emma reached across the table and covered her sister's hands with her own. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Jake stood up. He picked up the tin box and crossed to the fireplace and lifted the loose stone above the mantel, The same stone he'd put in specifically because a hiding place in a remote ranch wasn't a luxury. It was a precaution, and he set the box inside and replaced the stone. "We leave at first light tomorrow," he said. "Tonight we prepare. Noah, I need you to help me with the horses. Emma, there's a cellar under the back room. There's preserved food down there, and we'll need to pack for 4 days. Ben." "I can help," Ben said, sitting up straight. "I know you can. You're going to stay close to Lily today. Can you do that?" Ben looked at his youngest sister with the grave attentiveness of a 7-year-old who understood that his job was important, even if the exact nature of it wasn't fully clear to him. "Yes, sir," he said. "I can do that." Jake went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back because there was something he needed to say, and he was not a man who said things easily, but some things needed to be said while there was still time to say them. "Your father built something with what he found," Jake said. "He knew the cost, and he built it anyway. That's the kind of man worth taking 4 days across open country for." He let that sit for a moment. "We're going to get it there. I promise you that." Noah picked up his hat from the table. He looked at Jake with those old, careful eyes. "You can't promise that," he said. Not accusing, just honest. "No," Jake said. "But I can promise I won't stop trying." It was enough. For now, it was enough. Outside, the morning was heating up fast, the Texas flats baking under a sky gone white with sun. Somewhere down the road, Marsh would be delivering his report. Briggs would be getting the news that the Holloway Ranch had refused the courtesy, and somewhere in the territorial capital, Black Ridge's lawyers would already be drawing papers. Court orders, writs of custody for 4 orphaned children with no legal guardian. Because that was how it worked. That was how men with money and influence buried the truth. Not with guns, not first, not if they could help it. First, they came with paper. First, they came with law. And Jake had one day. They didn't make it to first light. Jake was in the barn at midnight checking the cinches on the second saddle when he smelled it. Not fire, not yet. Something earlier than fire. The particular dryness that comes when someone touches a flame to old wood 20 seconds before it catches. He dropped the cinch and ran. The back wall of the barn was already going when he got to the door. Not an accident. Not a lantern knocked in the dark. 3 separate points of flame spread evenly along the base of the wall, the kind of pattern a man makes when he wants the whole structure to go and he wants it to go fast. Jake had the horses out in under 2 minutes. He didn't go back for anything else. "Up," he said, coming through the door of the ranch house at a dead run. "Everybody up. Right now. We are leaving right now." Emma was off her cot before he finished the sentence. She shook Lily awake with both hands. Noah was already pulling on his boots in the dark, moving on instinct, because a boy who had already lived through one midnight raid understood the sound of urgency and didn't ask questions about it. Ben said, Jake, small voice, confused, reaching for orientation. "I've got you, Ben." Jake lifted him up with one arm and grabbed the tin box from above the mantel with the other hand, and they were out the door in under 3 minutes. Behind them, the barn was fully lit. The fire made no sound for a moment, just the light of it, enormous and orange, spilling across the flats, and then the roof caught, and it made every sound at once. Noah looked back at it. His jaw set hard. "They wanted us to run," he said. "They wanted us to panic and run," Jake said, getting Ben up onto the saddle in front of him. "We're going to do it better than that. We're going to run with a plan." He got them moving north by northwest off the main road by 200 yards through open country, where the ground was harder and left less track. He kept the pace steady fast enough to matter slow enough to hold together. The night was cooler than the day, but not cool. The heat stored in the ground all day, releasing back into the dark air, and the children rode in silence, each one closed around whatever they were carrying inside. They had ridden maybe 40 minutes when Emma pulled her horse alongside Jake's. "There's a rider on the ridge," she said quietly. "Left side. Been there since we left." Jake had already seen him. One rider sitting still watching them move. Not pursuing, just watching. He's marking our direction, Jake said. When he's sure where we're headed, he'll ride back and report it. Can we lose him? Not without losing time we don't have. Then what do we do? Jake thought for 3 seconds. We change direction. He turned them south away from the El Paso route, cutting toward the dry creek bed that ran parallel to the main road. The rider on the ridge watched, then moved, repositioning. He's going to follow us no matter what, Noah said. No, Jake said. He's going to report us no matter what. Those are different problems. He looked at Noah. You know this country. Some of it. Daddy used to survey out here. There's a ravine about 2 miles south that comes out behind the Delacroix property. Does that mean anything to you? Noah thought for a moment. The Delacroix brothers. Their land was on the Black Ridge acquisition list. It was. Which means they've got reason to help us, and a better reason to hate Black Ridge than most. Jake held the boy's look. You think you can find that ravine in the dark? Noah looked at the stars. He looked at the shape of the land. He looked at the ridge where the watcher had repositioned again, trying to get a cleaner angle on their movement. Yes, Noah said. Then lead. What happened next was the moment the boy became something else. Not just Thomas Carter's son surviving, but a person of his own substance, reading the land his father had mapped and using it the way his father had intended it to be used to protect people, to find the true shape of things. Noah rode to the front of the group without hesitation, and he led them south through the dark, and he didn't waver once. They lost the ridge rider somewhere around the first mile. The ravine closed around them and swallowed the sky, and whoever was up there couldn't see them anymore, and the sound of their horses went flat and close between the rock walls. And for a few minutes, the only world that existed was the narrow one directly in front of them. They came out on the back of the Delacroix property as the first gray showed in the east. Jules Delacroix met them at his fence with a rifle in one hand and a lantern in the other. He was a big, quiet man in his 50s, gray-bearded, with the particular stillness of someone who had already decided that today was going to require something from him and was bracing for it. He looked at Jake. He looked at the 4 children. He looked at the tin box under Jake's arm. Carter kids, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Jake said. Jules lowered the rifle. Come inside. Over coffee and bread, Jules told them what he'd heard in town the day before. Briggs had deputized 6 men. They were covering the 3 main roads out of the county, the north road to Abilene, the east road to San Angelo, and the western cutoff to El Paso. Every crossing watched, and Briggs had sent word to the county judge not to pursue a criminal warrant, but a civil one, a writ of dependency. On paper it said the Carter children were orphans without legal custodianship, requiring the intervention of the county for their protection, which meant anyone harboring them was technically in violation of a court order. That's how they're going to do it, Emma said, and her voice had gone cold and controlled. They're not going to arrest Jake for helping us. They're going to arrest him for what? Kidnapping. Unlawful detainment of minors, Jules said carefully. That's the language Briggs was using. That is the most cynical thing I have ever heard, Emma said. That's Black Ridge, Jules said. They've had a lot of practice. Jake looked at the documents spread across Jules's table. His eyes stopped on the payroll list, the column of names and dollar amounts and dates. He'd looked at it twice before. He looked at it again now with a different question in his mind. Jules, he said slowly. The name Halford, Federal Land Commissioner out of El Paso. You know anything about him? Jules's expression changed. Not much, just enough. Where did you hear that name? From Thomas Carter. He said Halford was the one honest man in the whole territorial structure. Jules was quiet for a moment. He poured himself more coffee and didn't drink it. Thomas said that, he said finally. He did. Thomas Carter was one of the best men I ever knew, Jules said. But he hadn't been to El Paso in 2 years. A lot can change in 2 years. He set down his cup. Halford took a position with a landholding company in January. Private sector. Very well compensated. Jake looked at the payroll list again. He ran his finger down the column until he found it. The initials. RH. A date 6 months ago. An amount that was not a small amount. Noah leaned over and read it. The blood left his face. "Daddy trusted him," Noah said. "He said if everything else failed—" "He didn't know," Jake said. "He couldn't have known." "Then who—" Emma's voice had a crack in it, the first crack she'd allowed since they left. "Who do we take it to? Briggs has the county. Halford has the federal office. The judge signed the writ. Who is there?" The question sat in the room like something with weight. Ben had fallen asleep against Lily's shoulder. Lily was awake watching Jake, her eyes moving between the papers and his face with an attention that didn't match the stillness of the rest of her. "There's another way," Jake said. Everyone looked at him. "The land commissioner is bought. The county judge is bought. The sheriff is complicit in 2 murders. Jake folded his hands on the table. "But there's one institution they can't buy outright. Not fast enough to matter. Not with this much evidence sitting on a table." "What institution?" Noah said. "A newspaper." Silence. "There's a correspondent for the Texas State Gazette who works out of San Marcos," Jake said. "Name of Aldous Webb. I knew his father 20 years ago. He's been writing about land fraud cases for 3 years, the bigger companies buying their way into the territories. He's been looking for something like what's in that box." Jake tapped the tin. "San Marcos is 2 days east. Same risk as El Paso, different roads. But if we get that documentation into Aldous Webb's hands, it doesn't go to one government office that Black Ridge can pressure. It goes to every newspaper in Texas, and then every newspaper in the country." Noah picked up the tin box. He turned it in his hands. "Daddy wanted the law to handle it." "The law is broken," Emma said quietly. "He wanted it done right." Noah. Emma looked at her brother across the table. "Getting the truth out is doing it right. That's what he was trying to do. The method doesn't matter. The truth getting out, that's what matters." Noah held the box for a long moment. Then he set it back down and looked at Jake. "San Marcos," he said. "San Marcos," Jake said. Jules stood up. "I can give you 3 horses and 2 days' provisions. I can't give you more than that without it being noticed." He paused. "There's something else. My neighbor to the east pitcher. He's been on Black Ridge's payroll for 4 months. He'll have seen you come through the ravine if he was up early enough. You need to move in the next hour." They were saddled and moving in 40 minutes. The first sign that Pitcher had talked came 2 hours later. They heard the riders before they saw them, 4 horses moving fast from the north, cutting across open country to intercept. Jake looked at the distance, looked at the terrain, looked at the children strung out behind him. "Ride," he said, not loud, just final. They ran. Ben was on the same horse as Jake, both arms locked around Jake's waist, and the boy didn't make a sound, not a cry, not a question, just held on with everything he had and let himself be carried. Emma and Lily rode together. Noah pushed his horse hard on Jake's left flank, staying even, his face set and furious. The pursuing riders were faster. Better horses, lighter loads. Jake did the math and it didn't come out right. Then the ground dropped. Jake felt it before he saw it. The slight change in the horses' gait, the shift in their weight, and he saw the dry creek bed cutting across their path 6 feet down and 20 wide, and he made the decision in half a second. "Hold on," he said to Ben. And he put the horse over the edge. They came down the bank in a controlled slide, hooves digging the horse, grunting with the effort and the shock of it, and they hit the flat bottom, and Jake had them moving again, before Emma and Lily's horse made it down behind them. Noah came last. His horse taking the bank, badly stumbling on the loose rock at the bottom, and Noah pulled the animal's head up hard and kept it upright through pure stubbornness. The creek bed cut south. Narrow banked high on both sides. The pursuing riders pulled up at the edge above them. Jake could hear the horses stopping, hear the men talking, hear the moment when they realized the creek bed was going to require a half-mile detour to find a crossing point. They had bought time, not a lot. "Keep moving," Jake said. They rode the creek bed for another mile before Jake pulled them up short. Ben had gone limp against him. Not unconscious, he could feel the boy breathing, but the kind of limp that came from a body that had used up everything it had and was running on the last thin reserves. "Ben." Jake put his hand on the boy's face. "Fever hot. Not as bad as the road into Dry Creek, but bad enough." "Ben talked to me. I'm all right," Ben said, with the absolute conviction of a 7-year-old who was not all right. "He needs water and shade," Emma said, pulling alongside. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. "Jake, he needs to stop." "I know." Jake looked at the walls of the creek bed around them. There was an overhang of rock 20 yards ahead, not much, but enough. 20 yards. We stop for 30 minutes. Give him water, get his temperature down. Then we move again. 30 minutes, Noah said. That's how much closer they get. I know that too. They stopped. Emma got Ben down and pressed the wet cloth she'd brought from Jules's house against the back of the boy's neck. Lily sat beside him and put her hand in his without speaking. Noah stood at the edge of the overhang, watching the direction they'd come, from his hand on the pistol Jake had given him that morning, the smaller one, the one that fit a 12-year-old's grip. Jake crouched beside Ben and watched the boy's color. After 10 minutes, it was better. After 20, Ben opened his eyes fully and said, "I'm sorry." "You don't apologize for being 7 years old in 100-degree heat," Jake said. "I'm slowing us down." "You're not slowing us down. You're the reason we're going fast enough to matter." Jake said it looking straight at the boy, not the gentle lie that adults told children, but the actual truth. "Your father built something that matters because of you and your brother and your sisters. Everything he did, so you'd still be here. You being here is the whole point." Ben stared at him. Then he said quietly, "Do you think he can see us?" Jake held the boy's eyes. 3 years of not thinking about his own son. 3 years of closing that door so hard the frame had warped. He felt it now, that warped frame and the thing behind it that had never gone anywhere. "I think," Jake said carefully, "that the people who love us and are gone, they leave something behind. In us. And when we do what they'd have wanted us to do, that thing they left behind gets stronger." He paused. "So yeah, I think he can see you. And I think he's proud." Ben didn't cry. He just nodded once, the nod of a child accepting something important, and then he said, "I'm ready to go now." They were moving again in 25 minutes. It was Lily who stopped them this time. She grabbed the back of Jake's saddle with one hand as he rode past her, and he pulled up short, turning to look at her. She hadn't grabbed at anything in 3 days. She'd been carried, led, guided, never initiating contact, never reaching out. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Her lips moved. He leaned down. "The map," she said. Her voice barely existed, a breath shaped into words. "Daddy drew a second map. I watched him do it." She stopped, swallowed hard. "He put it inside the lining, the tin. There's a false bottom." Jake looked at the tin box in his saddlebag. He pulled it out and handed it to Noah. Noah turned it over. Pressed the bottom. Pressed it again with more force. They all heard the small, thin click, and the false bottom gave way, and a second folded document dropped into Noah's palm. It was a map, more detailed than the ones in the main documents. It covered the same Western territory, but this one had something the others didn't. Names. Not just Black Ridge's executives, not just the local officials. Names that went up. Federal names. A judge in the territorial court. A land office supervisor in Austin. A state senator with dollar amounts beside his name and dates going back 4 years. Noah looked up at Jake. "This isn't just Black Ridge," he said. "No," Jake said. "This goes all the way to the Capitol." "Yes." "Then a newspaper isn't enough." Noah's voice had gone very still, and very certain, the voice he used when he'd made a decision and meant it all the way down. "We need the federal marshal's office. We need someone outside the state entirely." Emma had ridden back to look at the document over Noah's shoulder. She straightened up and looked at Jake. "Can you get us there?" Behind them, faint but getting less faint, the sound of horses. Jake put the document back in the box. the box back in the saddlebag, and got his horse moving. "I can get you there," he said, "but we have to ride all night." And they did. They rode through the night and into the gray edge of morning, and by the time the horses started favoring their feet, and Ben had gone limp against Jake's chest, for the third time, San Marcos was close enough that Jake could smell water on the air from the river. He had kept them off the main road for 6 hours. He had made decisions in the dark that he couldn't fully explain. Turn here, cross there, cut through this farmer's back pasture, and most of them had been right, which he figured was the kind of luck that came not from fortune, but from desperation, compounding itself into instinct. They had heard riders twice in the night. Both times Jake had pulled them into stillness and silence, and waited, and both times the riders had moved past without finding them. Noah hadn't slept. Emma hadn't either. They had ridden in the particular silence of people who have decided that stopping means losing, and losing means something they are not willing to name. Jake found Aldous Webb's office above the print shop on the main street, before the town was fully awake. He knocked 3 times, and then 3 more. When the door opened, Webb was in his shirt sleeves, 50 years old, and sharp-eyed with the look of a man who had been half asleep and was now completely awake because he recognized what was standing on his threshold. "Jake Holloway," he said. "What in God's name?" "I need 20 minutes, Jake said. "And I need you to not say my name loud on a public street." Webb stepped back and let them in. He read for 11 minutes without speaking. Jake counted because he needed something to do with the tension that had been building in him since midnight, and counting was better than what he'd otherwise be doing with it. The children sat around Webb's cluttered office, Emma upright watching Webb's face for every shift in expression, Noah with his elbows on his knees, Ben asleep finally against Lily's shoulder, Lily watching the window. When Webb looked up, his face had gone the particular pale of a man who has found the thing he has been looking for and is now confronting the full weight of what finding it means. "The second document," he said. "The names. Senator Aldrich is on here." "I know," Jake said. "He's being considered for a federal judicial appointment. There's a confirmation hearing in Washington in 3 weeks." "I know that too." Webb set the papers down. He pressed both hands flat on his desk and looked at the documents and then at the 4 children in his office and then at Jake. "This is the largest land fraud case in the history of this territory," he said. "Possibly in the history of this state." "Yes," Jake said. "And you brought it to me." "Thomas Carter built it. His children carried it. I just drove." Webb looked at Emma. "Your father was a surveyor for Black Ridge." "He was," Emma said, "until he realized what he was surveying for. Then he stopped being useful to them." "How old are you?" 13. Webb picked up the documents again. "I can have this in print within 24 hours. The Gazette, the State Journal, and I have a contact at the Associated Press, who will have it on the wire to New York and Washington before nightfall." He paused. "But there's a problem." "Briggs," Jake said. "Briggs has a court writ. It came through the circuit judge last night. I heard about it this morning before you knocked. County custody order for 4 Carter minors pending a dependency hearing. Any adult in possession of those children without county authorization is in violation of a court order. Yes, we covered that." "Jake." Webb's voice was careful and precise. "That writ means Briggs can walk in here right now and take those children legally. And if he takes them, this—" he put his hand on the documents, "goes with them. Into a Black Ridge file cabinet somewhere, and it disappears." The room went very quiet. Then Noah said, "So we have to move faster than the writ." "That's correct," Webb said. "Then stop talking about it and start printing." Webb looked at the 12-year-old boy across his desk. He blinked once. Then he stood up and went to the door that connected to the print shop below and called down to his typesetter to come up immediately. And when the man appeared, Webb handed him 2 of the pages and said, "We are stopping everything else. This is what we are setting today." They heard the horses 20 minutes later. Jake went to the window. 3 riders, Briggs in front, 2 deputies flanking him, moving up the main street at a deliberate walk. Not hiding, not hurrying. The the pace of a man with legal authority who wants to be seen using it. "Backstairs," Webb said without looking up from his desk. "Down through the print shop, out the alley behind the building. The Methodist Church is 2 blocks west. Speak to Reverend Dalloway. Tell him I sent you. He will put you somewhere Briggs won't look. The documents. I have them. You have copies." Noah held up the tin box. "We kept the originals." "Then go. Now." Emma grabbed Ben and had him on his feet before Jake reached the door. They went down the back stairs in a controlled rush through the noise and ink smell of the print shop, past the typesetter who didn't look up from his work, and out into the alley. They heard Briggs's voice from the front of the building as they cleared the back. Loud official, the particular tone a man uses when he wants witnesses to hear his authority being exercised properly. They moved. Reverend Dalloway was a small white-haired man who listened to Jake for 45 seconds and then opened a door in the back of the church without a word and put them in a room that smelled of hymnals and candle wax and let them stay there while the morning passed and the town outside woke up fully and Briggs moved through it looking for them. It was in that room, in that stillness, that Emma finally broke. Not loudly, not with the drama of someone performing grief. She sat in the corner of the room with her knees pulled up, and she put her face in her hands, and she shook silently, with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding something together for so long that the muscles have given out, and the only option left is to let go of it for a few minutes. Jake sat beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just sat there, the way you sit beside someone who needs the weight of another person nearby without needing anything from that person. After a while, she said, still muffled by her hands, "I should have woken them up that night. I should have screamed. If I'd screamed, they would have run. We all would have run. Emma, I just stood at the window and watched. I didn't do anything. You were 13 years old. I'm 13 years old now, and I'm doing something." "Yes," Jake said. "You are. Because you're still here. Because you walked that road, and you got your family through, and you're still here." He paused. "Your parents are the ones who made that possible. They raised you to be someone who keeps going when everything says to stop. That's not an accident. That's on purpose." Emma lowered her hands. Her face was wet, but her eyes were steady again. She looked at him for a long moment. "You had a son," she said. Jake went still. "I found the photograph in the ranch house," she said. "I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for an extra blanket, and it was in the chest. A boy, maybe 7 or 8. Dark hair." "Matthew," Jake said. The name cost something to say. It always cost something to say. "What happened to him?" Jake was quiet for long enough that she might have let it go. But she didn't let it go. She waited with the patience of a girl who had learned that important things were worth waiting for. "Fire," he said. 3 years ago. The winter. A coal oil lantern." He stopped. "I wasn't there. I'd ridden out to check on the south pasture fence, and there was a storm, and I couldn't get back until morning, and by morning—" He stopped again. "By morning, the house was gone, and Matthew was gone, and my wife had gotten the animals out, and then gone back inside one more time for something, and she didn't come back out either." Emma said nothing. She put her hand on Jake's arm. Just that. No words. The gesture of a child who had learned that some grief was past language and that sitting beside it was the most useful thing. "That's why you stopped," she said finally. "On the road. When you saw Ben." "I saw Matthew," Jake said simply. The door opened, and Noah put his head in. "Webb's here," he said. "With someone else." The someone else was a compact, weathered man in a dark coat who introduced himself as Deputy Federal Marshal Cutter out of Austin, who had ridden through the night after receiving a telegram from Webb at 9 the previous evening, before Jake and the children had even arrived, which meant Webb had moved on instinct before seeing a single document on the strength of Jake's name alone. Cutter read the second document, the one with the federal names, standing up in 4 minutes. When he finished, he folded it carefully and put it inside his coat. "I need to get to Austin today," he said. "Briggs has 3 deputies working the roads," Jake said. "Briggs doesn't have jurisdiction over a federal marshal," Cutter said. "What he has is a county writ for the children, And that writ is going to be challenged in federal court as of this afternoon, which is going to require a federal judge, which is going to require a hearing, which is going to require these children to testify. He looked at Emma. Can you testify? Yes, Emma said. Noah. Yes, sir. Cutter looked at Lily. Lily was looking at him without expression, her lips slightly parted, her hands folded. She doesn't speak, Jake said quietly. Not since the night her parents were taken. Cutter nodded slowly. A child's testimony isn't required to be verbal in a federal proceeding. She can write it down, she can draw it, she can communicate it however she's able. He paused. But a voice carries weight in a room that a written statement doesn't. If there's any possibility, there isn't, Emma said, and her voice had an edge in it, a sister's protective instinct that was also a warning. Jake looked at Lily. Lily was still looking at Cutter. And then very slowly she turned her head and looked at Jake. He held her look. Lily, he said, gentle and direct. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Nobody in that room can make you speak. That's yours. That belongs to you. Lily said nothing. But I want you to know something, Jake continued. What you saw that night, you are the only person in the world who saw it. Your mother fought. Did you know that Emma told me? She fought back. She was brave. Jake kept his voice level and soft. I think she'd want someone to say so, in a room full of people. So it's real. So it's true out loud, not just in your head. Something moved in Lily's face. Something cracked along a line that had been sealed for weeks. She turned back to Cutter. She didn't speak, but she nodded. Once. The federal hearing convened in Austin 3 days later. Black Ridge's attorneys were already there when they arrived, 3 of them expensive suits, and practiced contempt, positioned at a long table, with a stack of motions and injunctions and counterfilings that had been prepared well in advance. Senator Aldrich's personal attorney sat in the gallery making notes. 2 men Jake didn't recognize by name, but recognized by type, the kind of men who solved problems before they became problems, sat near the back door. The federal judge brought in from Dallas specifically because every Austin judicial appointment had potential conflict called the room to order, and the Black Ridge attorney was on his feet immediately with a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the documents had been obtained through illegal seizure and that the witnesses were minors without legal standing. Cutter handed the judge a counterfiling. The judge read it. He looked at the Black Ridge attorney. Motion denied, he said. The attorney tried twice more, and was denied twice more, and then sat down with the compressed fury of a man who had expected this to be easier and was recalibrating. Emma testified first. She spoke for 40 minutes. Her voice didn't shake. She answered every cross-examination question with the same clear, unhurried precision she brought to everything. And when the Black Ridge attorney tried to suggest she had misidentified Briggs on the night her parents were taken, she looked him directly in the eye and said, I have been looking at Callum Briggs's face in this courtroom for 20 minutes, sir, and it is the same face I saw by lantern light the night he put my father in a wagon. I don't make that kind of mistake. The attorney sat down. Noah was next. He placed the tin box on the table and opened it and laid out every document in the order his father had arranged them, explaining each one in the methodical, careful way of a boy who had memorized the contents during the long writing nights of the past week. When he reached the payroll list, he read each name aloud, including Senator Aldrich's, and the room behind him erupted, and the judge gavelled it down, and Noah didn't stop reading until he'd read every name. Then it was Lily's turn. She walked to the witness chair without being guided. She sat down. She was 9 years old, and she sat in a federal courtroom in Austin with every eye in the room on her, and she looked at the judge, and she folded her hands in her lap. The room was completely silent. Lily opened her mouth, and in a voice that was just barely loud enough to carry rough from disuse thin as paper but absolutely clear, she said, They came at night. 3 men, 1 wagon. My daddy came out with his hands up and he looked at our door because we were behind it, and he was scared for us, but not for himself. She paused, swallowed, kept going. The man who grabbed my mama had a brand on his hand. She scratched his face and my daddy said her name and she stopped fighting and she looked at our door one more time. Another pause. The room wasn't breathing. Then the wagon drove away, and nobody in town came to help us. Not one person, for 3 weeks. Not one. She stopped speaking. She put her hands back in her lap and looked at the judge. The room stayed silent for 3 full seconds. Then it broke apart completely. The courtroom didn't quiet down for 4 full minutes. The judge gavelled until his arm was tired. The Black Ridge attorneys were on their feet, all 3 of them talking at once, and the gallery was talking back at them. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Lily sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, as though the noise were happening in a room she was only partially occupying. Jake watched her from his seat behind the low railing. He watched her the way you watch someone who has just done the hardest thing they will ever do and doesn't yet know they've survived it. When the room finally came to order, the lead Black Ridge attorney stood and said in the careful tone of a man playing his last card, "Your Honor, the testimony of a traumatized child of 9 years cannot be admitted as material evidence in a proceeding of this magnitude. We move again for immediate dismissal on grounds of counsel." The judge's voice was flat and final. "Sit down." "Your Honor?" "I said sit down." The attorney sat down. The judge looked at the room. He looked at the documents laid out on the table. He looked at Noah Carter, 12 years old, who had placed each one with the care of someone completing his father's unfinished work. He looked at Lily still sitting in the witness chair, still folded into her own quiet. "I'm issuing a federal preservation order on every document submitted today," the judge said. "I'm referring the matter of Senator Aldrich and the named officials to the United States Attorney General's office by wire this afternoon. And I am issuing an immediate warrant for the arrest of Callum Briggs County Deputy on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and suspected complicity in the disappearance and presumed death of Thomas and Ruth Carter." He picked up his gavel. "This hearing is recessed pending federal investigation." The gavel came down like a period at the end of a sentence that had been a very long time coming. Briggs was arrested in Dry Creek the next morning. Jake heard about it from Webb, who had ridden hard from San Marcos with the news, and a copy of the front page of the Gazette, which carried the full story across 4 columns under a headline that Webb had written himself. 2 federal deputies had found Briggs at the sheriff's office, and Briggs had tried to argue jurisdiction for 11 minutes before one of the deputies informed him that jurisdiction was exactly what he no longer had, and he had gone quietly, which Jake thought was its own kind of statement, that the men who used the law as a weapon were often the first to fold when the law turned around. He named names. Webb told Jake over the table at the boarding house where they'd taken rooms in Austin. Before they even got him to the county line, he was already talking. 3 Black Ridge executives, the circuit judge who signed the dependency writ, the land office supervisor in Austin. Webb spread the papers on the table. The Harmon family has already filed a lawsuit for the return of their land. The Delacroix brothers submitted a sworn statement this morning. 6 other families have come forward in the past 18 hours. And Aldrich, Jake said. His attorney left town last night. Aldrich himself sent a letter to the governor's office this morning requesting, and I am quoting, the opportunity to cooperate fully with any federal inquiry. Webb's voice carried the dry satisfaction of a man who had been right for 3 years and was now watching the proof of it assemble itself publicly. He won't see a federal bench. He'll be lucky to see the outside of a courtroom from the right side of the railing. Jake looked at the front page of the Gazette. He looked at his own name in the 3rd paragraph and the children's names and Thomas Carter's name in the headline. He looked at all of it for a long moment. "Thomas built this," he said. "Thomas built the foundation," Webb said. "His kids carried it across 200 miles of open country, and I drove." "Jake." Webb looked at him steadily. "You know what this town would have looked like if you'd driven past those children on that road?" Jake didn't answer that. He picked up his coffee and drank it. The harder fight, as it turned out, was not the criminal case. The criminal case moved with the momentum of its own evidence. Too much documentation, too many witnesses, too many named officials suddenly willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced exposure. Black Ridge Energy filed for dissolution of its Texas operations within 3 weeks. Its executives were indicted within 6. The water records Thomas Carter had compiled were confirmed by a federal geological survey that found evidence of deliberate contamination at 4 sites along the Upper Creek, and the restoration order was issued before the summer was out. The harder fight was a single document that arrived at the Austin boarding house 11 days after the hearing. It was addressed to Jake Holloway, and it was from the county family court, and it informed him that the matter of guardianship for the 4 Carter minors remained unresolved, and that a formal dependency hearing had been scheduled for the following month to determine appropriate placement. Emma read it over his shoulder. "They're not done," she said. "No," Jake said. "They're going to try to put us in county care." "They're going to try." "Can they?" Jake folded the letter. "Only if we let them." He spent the next 3 days with a lawyer, a real one, a federal one. A woman named Clara Marsh, who had no relation to Denton Marsh and who had been practicing family law in Austin for 15 years, and had a reputation for the kind of stubbornness that courtrooms either loved or feared depending on which side of it you were standing on. She reviewed the situation, reviewed Jake's circumstances, single male rancher, no formal family connection to the children, and told him plainly that it would not be easy. "The court's preference is always for established family structure," she said. "Single male applicants for custody of 4 children, particularly unrelated children, face a significant burden of proof." "What kind of proof?" Jake said. "That you can provide stability, consistent care, financial sufficiency, emotional support." She looked at him over the top of her spectacles. "And that the children themselves want this. That carries significant weight, particularly given their ages." "They want it," Jake said. "Then bring them to the hearing and let them say so." The night before the custody hearing, Jake found Noah sitting on the back steps of the boarding house in the dark, in the same position he'd sat on Jake's porch that first night, knees up, hands loose, looking at something far out. Jake sat beside him. "You nervous?" Noah said. "Some," Jake said. "You." "I've been nervous since the night they took my parents. I don't really notice it anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "What if the judge says no? Then we appeal. And if the appeal, then we appeal that." Jake said it with a flatness that wasn't resignation, but its opposite. "Noah, I am not walking away from this. You understand me. Whatever they put in front of us, we keep going. That's what your father did. That's what we do." Noah was quiet for a long time. A warm Texas night, the first week of September, the heat finally beginning to break at the edges. "I've been thinking about what he said," Noah told him. "Daddy. When he gave me the box. He said the right person would come and I'd know." He paused. "I knew. When you got down in the dirt with Ben on the road. When you didn't think about it, you just did it. I knew then." Jake didn't have an answer for that. He sat with it. "I want to be that," Noah said. "Whatever that is, whatever makes a person do that instead of pulling their curtains shut." He looked at Jake sideways. "You think it can be taught?" "I think it can be chosen," Jake said. "Over and over, every time it costs something." Noah nodded slowly. "That's harder." "Yes," Jake said. "It is." The custody hearing lasted 2 hours. Clara Marsh presented the financial documentation, the character references Webb, Reverend Dalloway, and in a development that had surprised Jake genuinely, Jules Delacroix, who had ridden 4 days to Austin specifically to testify that Jake Holloway was the kind of man you trusted with what mattered most. The county attorney pushed back on the single-parent structure, pushed back on the lack of familial connection, pushed back on the remoteness of the ranch as an appropriate educational environment. Then Clara said, "Your Honor, I'd like the children to speak." Noah went first. He was brief and precise, and said everything that needed saying without a single unnecessary word, which Jake thought Thomas Carter would have recognized as his own quality, returned in his son's voice. Ben went second. He was 7 years old, and he stood up and said, Jake stopped his wagon when nobody else would. I think that means something. And then he sat down. Lily went third. She stood at the front of the room, and she looked at the judge and she said, "He sat beside me when I couldn't talk. He didn't try to make me. He just stayed." She folded her hands. "I'd like to stay too." Emma went last. She stood up and she looked at the county attorney, and she looked at the judge and she said, "I am 13 years old. I have kept my family alive for 3 weeks on no help and no resources in 100-degree heat, and I have carried my father's evidence across 200 miles of open country, while being hunted by the same people who murdered my parents, and I have sat in that witness chair and told this state the truth." She paused. "I am telling you the truth now. Jake Holloway is our family. He chose it. We choose it. And with respect, sir, that choice belongs to us." The county attorney started to speak. The judge held up one hand. "I've heard enough," he said. He looked down at his papers. He looked at the 4 children standing at the front of his courtroom. He picked up his pen. "Guardianship is granted," he said. The sound Emma made was not a cheer and not a cry. It was something in between a single exhaled sound, like a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally remembered that they don't have to anymore. Ben grabbed Jake's hand. Jake held it. A year passed. The well water in Dry Creek was tested clean by October. The federal restoration team finished their work on the Upper Creek by spring, and the Harmon family moved back to their land in April with a federal deed that superseded everything Black Ridge had filed. The Delacroix brothers planted their south field for the first time in 3 years. 6 other families returned to properties they had abandoned or sold under duress, and the county court was kept busy with restitution cases for the better part of 18 months. Callum Briggs received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. 3 Black Ridge executives received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. Senator Aldrich resigned his seat and avoided criminal prosecution through a cooperation agreement that cost him everything except his freedom, which his lawyer argued was the appropriate trade and which most people in Texas argued was not. The county judge who had signed the dependency writ lost his seat and his license. The circuit court cleared his docket and started over. In February, Aldous Webb published a long-form account of the Carter case in the Texas State Gazette that was reprinted in 14 newspapers across the country, including 2 in New York. He sent Jake a copy with a note that said simply, "Thomas Carter deserved this. So do his children. A.W." Jake put the note in the tin box beside the documents which he kept above the fireplace at the ranch. Not hidden anymore, just kept. In Dry Creek, a small stone marker was placed in the center of the main street, funded entirely by the families who had lost land and recovered it. The inscription had been written by Noah Carter, who was 13 by then, and had decided quietly and without announcement that he was going to spend his life writing things that mattered. It read, "For Thomas and Ruth Carter, who told the truth when it cost everything. For their children, who carried it when they had nothing else. For the one man who stopped." Emma read law books in the evenings. She had a particular interest in land rights and water law and the ways that institutions could be bent by money and straightened again by documentation, and she asked Jake questions about the Carter case with the focused intensity of someone building a framework she intended to use for the rest of her life. She was going to be formidable. Jake already knew it. He suspected the legal profession of Texas would find out in another decade. Noah wrote everything down. He kept a journal of the whole year, the hearing, the arrests, the families returning to their land the day the water tested clean, and when Webb offered him a summer position at the Gazette. Noah accepted it without hesitation and came home that August with ink-stained hands and the particular satisfaction of someone who has found the thing they were made for. Lily sang in the church choir by March. Her voice came back slowly, like something that had gone underground in winter and was finding its way back through the frost. She was not the same child who had walked the road into Dry Creek. She was something harder and softer at once, someone who understood that silence could be chosen or imposed, and who had made a firm decision about which kind she would live with going forward. When she sang, people in the congregation said it was something different from ordinary singing. Jake thought they were right, though he could not have said exactly why. except that her voice carried something in it that most voices didn't, the knowledge of what it had cost to use it. Ben turned 8 in November and had a birthday for the first time in 2 years with a cake Emma made and 4 candles, and Noah reading aloud from the journal, and Lily singing one song, just one, and Jake watching the boy laugh genuinely freely. The full-body laugh of a child who has been allowed to be a child again and feeling something unlock in himself that he had bolted shut on a winter morning 3 years before. He stood on his porch one evening in August, the summer tipping toward its end, the air finally beginning to cool, and he thought about Dry Creek, about that road, about the circle of townspeople who had stood watching and done nothing. He thought about the curtains that had moved and gone still. He thought about Briggs's arms folded across his chest. He thought about the courtesy that Blackridge had extended the option that had been available to him. Drive past, look away. Let it go. Protect himself. Live the small, safe life of a man who had already lost enough and was not going to lose more. He thought about Ben's face in the dirt. He thought about Lily's voice in that courtroom, rough and thin and absolutely clear. He had not stopped his wagon because he was brave. He had not stopped it because he was noble or selfless, or because he had calculated the cost and decided it was worth paying. He had stopped it because something in him had recognized something in those children, the specific irreducible truth of 4 people who needed one person to choose them, and his hands had pulled the reins before his mind had finished deciding. He understood now that this was what had saved him. Not the legal victory, not the arrests, not even the children exactly, though the children were everything the children were, the whole of it. What had saved him was the moment itself. The decision made before, it was a decision. The choice that lived below, thinking the part of a person that knows what matters before the rest of them catches up. Thomas Carter had known what mattered. Ruth Carter had looked back at a door because the people behind it mattered more than whatever came next. And 4 children had walked a scorching road with bleeding feet because they were the carriers of something true, and truth, as Lily had told them in a quiet room when her voice had barely existed, doesn't die. It waits. Jake went back inside. Emma was at the table with her law books. Noah was writing. Ben was asleep already, one arm thrown over the edge of his cot, easy and boneless, in the way of children who feel safe. Lily was sitting near the window, humming something low, more breath than voice, her eyes on the dark outside. She turned when Jake came in and gave him the small private smile she reserved for moments when no performance was required, when it was just family and quiet, and the specific warmth of a house that held people who had chosen each other. Jake sat down. He picked up his coffee. He looked around at what his life had become. A man who had stopped his wagon. 4 children who had refused to let their parents' truth die in the dirt. And a town that would spend a long time learning what it cost to look away and what it was worth at last to stop. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole story, and it was true.